Hello, and welcome to Insights with Dr. C. I'm your host, Dr. Douglas Carpenter. I'm a clinical psychologist who's been in practice for over 20 years. My wife, Marrige Carpenter, a licensed master social worker, and I are the owners of Insight Counseling Services in Rochester, Michigan. Thank you for joining us today. Today's topic is going to be managing financial issues in a second marriage. This is Rhonda Williams. Rhonda, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Rhonda is a certified financial planner and a certified divorce financial analyst from Ameriprise Financial Advisors in Rochester, Michigan. We had Rhonda on the show before, and we talked about divorce from your first marriage and really talked about the value of collaborative divorce. And today we're going to be talking, like I said, about second marriages and how to work your finances together. My first question for you, Rhonda, today is the divorce process can be so traumatic for so many people, even in the best scenarios. It just completely disrupts a person's life. It's difficult enough to make good financial decisions, on your own or coming out of a first marriage, but when you approach a second marriage, what's the best way to do this? And can you give us some illustrations in your practice of how you've seen this happen or how you've helped people come together for a second marriage?
So I'll tell you a story about a couple of dear friends, John and Nancy. And so John and Nancy had been married previously. John, I think, was 43. Nancy is 37, of course, not their real names.
Right.
But so John and Nancy decide that they want to get married. And for both of them, this is second marriage. And they plan this elaborate wedding, out at the shore by mom and dad's house. And he's going to wait under the willow trees for her with his two sons, 13 and 9, and she's going to get out of the limousine with her two daughters, and then together they'll meet under the willow tree and proceed to the beach and have this blessed second union and
live happily ever after.
Happily ever after. And it's this great analogy, and of two families blending together, and all six of them walking down to the shore to get married as a family. And they spend a lot of time planning for this great wedding, but perhaps not a lot of time planning for how they're going to deal with their finances. And in fact, things are kind of a mess as they're going into this because they haven't given a lot of thought to, how they're going to merge these families.
Seems like a really big step.
It is.
When it comes to finances.
And people often are we're all different people, right? And so opposites attract, and she's great at financial planning and budgeting and tracking things, and he's not so great. And she has a good relationship and communication with her ex, and him, they're not talking anymore. And she wants to give allowances to the kids, and he has a very different view on that. So you have two very different people and a blending of a family coming together. It's going to be a complex thing to figure this out. Yes. Yeah. So advice that I would give to people who are going into this is I would say, the same kind of advice that I give to people who are approaching divorce. Is that, you should gather all of your documents and get a good handle on what your assets and what your liabilities are, what benefits you have through work, gather your financial life together, and each of you, before getting married again, should spell it all out, that this is what I have, this is what you have, and then you exchange, and you begin a dialogue about, how you're going to bring these households together.
Okay. So what should be disclosed in those lists?
Yeah.
What kind of things would you expect to see or be looking for going into that second marriage?
So we're looking at things like what are your debts? What's your payment history? What's your credit score? Have you ever filed for bankruptcy? What's your obligation to your first marriage and those children? And do you have to pay child support? And have you given a portion of your retirement assets to your first spouse? So that now going into a second marriage, there may not be as many resources for that family to draw upon to move forward. So there should be disclosure on exactly what they have and how that's going to work for them.
How often do you see that couples entering second marriages have provided full disclosure to one another? Do you see that as common, uncommon?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that they think that they've done the best that they can to disclose, but it's not necessarily, they may not know what to disclose and what would be important, because perhaps they've never done a financial plan for themselves to say, this is what I have and how it's going to work for me, and this is what I've left, with my first family and what I need to fulfill that obligation. No, I think people are pretty good about sharing with one another, but now we're going to try to take two different households and merge them into one, and we've got a lot of complex moving parts with that.
Yeah, so definitely your debt should be on that list.
And your benefits and your assets.
And your benefits, okay, your assets. What about like inheritance?
Yeah.
I mean,
so that would be the next thing, is an inheritance actually drives how second marriages come together. So an example might be, and it's different with it. This comes up more with older people who become married, who've accumulated something since their last divorce, and now they're moving into the second marriage, and they have something that they want to leave behind for their children. And so if your entire financial plan is driven by what you want to leave to somebody, then how do you manage your day-to-day? For example, you may draw a prenup to protect these assets in light of an inheritance. And I'm not a lawyer, but I'm familiar with these structures and how they play out for people. So a prenuptial agreement is something that a couple would agree that an asset coming into the marriage remains with that person, and then upon the death, that asset goes to, that person's children, or for the use of the spouse for a while, and then it would go to the children. And so it's protecting that asset in the event that, there could be another divorce. So that's how prenups work. And in that case, you may see an older couple come in, and she got the house in her first divorce. And so she has the house, and she wants to protect that house for her children. It's the home that her children grew up in, and she doesn't want to, in any event, the second marriage doesn't work out. No matter what, she wants her children to get this house. But then what happens on the day-to-day management of money, where maybe you need a new furnace in the house, and now who pays for that?
Right.
Because that's a home where two people are living together, and that could get complicated. The other thing, if this is all driven by, estate planning and who's going to inherit things in the end, you may see a situation where, the dad has saved money, for his retirement and for his asset use, but now they're remarried and they have a teenage child. And you may not be familiar, but on the FAFSA form...
Can you explain what a FAFSA form is?
So the FAFSA form is a government form that is used by colleges and other higher education institutions that determine how much aid your child will receive to help them pay for college, which we know it's outrageous, right?
Right.
And so it's very important on that form that you're able to accurately portray what the assets you have that can be used for that. So stepdad, he may be thinking that he's got these assets over here that are protected for himself, but the government wants to see those assets. And so they actually get pulled into the FAFSA form. And now, what do we do? Are we going to ask stepdad to pay for Johnny's education at University of Chicago for $55,000 a year? And so some of these agreements need to be kind of planned out in advance. And if not, you can see how this would produce a lot of conflict in a family.
Right. So you mentioned prenuptial agreements. And I know you're not an attorney, but you are a very qualified financial advisor. What is your opinion about prenuptial agreements?
Well,
Can I ask your personal opinion?
I think my personal opinion, sure. I think that some people are afraid to have a prenup because they think that means that they're already making plans for the next divorce.
Okay.
Because the prenuptial agreement protects your assets going into a marriage. And to kind of talk about assets within marriage, everybody comes in with separate assets. These are things that you owned before you got married, and then you have joint assets. And those are assets you acquired during the marriage. Some things that might be a separate asset could be an inheritance that your great-grandma wanted you to receive, and so long as you keep that money separate, that's a separate asset within a marriage.
I know I've seen couples come in, and I've even seen them come in for the purpose of they're getting ready to enter their second marriage, and one person or the other is wanting a prenuptial agreement, but the other person is adamantly opposed to that and resistant and saying, well, does this mean that you think we're going to get a divorce like you
Right.
said? Or do you not trust me? Do you not love me enough to think that I wouldn't do that to you if we were to get divorced?
Right.
However, from my standpoint, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm
Yeah.
a psychologist, I somewhat tend to encourage them to look into that.
Well,
And
yeah.
to accept that because of some of the things that you've just mentioned, that you have family assets, you have family heirlooms, you have family money that's come down that's really designated for various people. And
Yeah.
how do you get that to happen if there's not a written plan
Right.
of some kind, or it's not stated in a will, or...
And it can cause a lot of conflict.
Oh, a lot.
And so having these boundaries, and that's what legal documents do, is they define boundaries and they allow people to live amongst each other in an agreement. But what could happen in a situation like that, and where a financial advisor could be very helpful, is if you have a couple and they're tossing around the idea of these legal agreements going into a second marriage and determining who they need to protect, there are some very creative solutions that people may not be aware that they can use. For example, let's take the case of the home, and who's going to pay for the maintenance on this home while they're living in it together, and how is that going to work out? Well, that asset and investments around that could end up being drained out, right?
Right.
During the marriage, and it could end up being lopsided. Maybe one person comes into the marriage with a lot of assets, but they get used up. Well, if you're trying to protect an estate for a child or for some other beneficiary, they're not going to get that until you're gone, right?
Right.
And so that's where life insurance can be very helpful. And a financial advisor could come in and say, well, now let's build a life insurance plan that protects your estate and provides for these heirs in an efficient manner so that you can live amongst each other in peace and harmony and build lives together. But there are still some things that, perhaps a person wouldn't want to commingle or add together to
Right.
joint assets. So,
Is there any way that you could give us a horror story
a horror story.
that you're
Wow.
familiar with, or that you've seen
Yeah.
where maybe a couple went into a second marriage and they didn't have some kind of
Yeah.
agreement about inheritance? Or can you just kind of give us a view of how traumatic this could be for a family?
Well, I think a lot of second marriages don't make it for this reason, that they go in with a wish that they can live together, but they don't have a plan. And because they don't have this spelled out in advance, the conflict grows and it can escalate over things like kids going to college, or even as small as a younger couple marrying, and how they're going to treat money management with the children and allowances and things like that. So I think the horror story is that a lot of second marriages don't make it, because there's not a good understanding and expectation of what these legal documents do, and there's not a good understanding of how to build a life together that would allow them to share assets and share out of their abundance and good times and bad, which is what marriage is, right?
Right. It's definitely a combination of good and bad. That's why it says for better or worse.
Yeah.
Some days are worse, some days are better.
Better than worse and worse. Yeah.
So I can definitely see how this could be so difficult, especially if you're a person who has a fair amount of assets, or
Yeah.
let's say maybe you own a business, or
Right.
are part of a family business, and now you bring in another person, another spouse, to be part of this. I can see where prenuptials would be.
Well, and there are other tools. So, there are legal documents, and then there's just some practical financial advice about how to manage money on day to day. So, a lot of financial advisors will use a pot system. So you have, the first illustration is the one pot, perhaps where a young couple that neither one of them are coming into the marriage with very many assets or resources. And so there's really nothing to lose, right?
Right.
And so
They need everything
They
they've
need
got to
everything
live.
they've got to live. And so they go into one pot together. It's joint. Everybody adds their resources. Everybody takes out as they need it. It's more like a traditional first marriage. And then there is, a two-pot where they each say, I want my own autonomy. I've been living on my own perhaps for a very long time, or I have my own wealth, and I don't feel a need to share that wealth with you, and you can spend your money and I can spend my money. We'll divide up household things. I'll tell you that doesn't work for very long, because at some point somebody is going to feel like they're sharing the bulk of the expenses.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because in my experience, when a couple comes in for me and they have separate money, to me that is just a big red flag. That there has not been coagulation here, if I can use that word. They have not come together and are not working as a team.
That's right.
So, I mean, I have really seen a lot of conflict and animosity and resentment in couples that come in who have different sets of money. In fact, I'm familiar with a couple who actually right now, second marriage, they came in with money. They're trying to divide most of the bills and these kinds of things. But the male is off spending his money somewhere and won't tell the other spouse where he's spending the money. And so, I mean, it's pretty clear to me that it's very possible that he has a gambling problem.
Well, it could be. And, they have to be careful, because if this ended up becoming a divorce situation, that the person who, even though he has a separate account that he's maintaining, the income that is arriving while they're married is joint. And that, he could be in a situation where in discovery, perhaps they would find out that he had spent it outside of the family, outside of the marriage, and he might have to pay her back.
Oh, wow.
In time, if they were to divorce, that could happen.
Yeah, because I think there's a pension there that he gets in his part of his money. But it seems to be dwindling and spent every month. But the amount that he receives is not kind of equaling the amount of bills that they're sharing. So there's a lot of suspicion now.
There's going to be a lot of conflict, right?
Right, and so there's mistrust in the relationship.
Right.
So.
And they don't know where they stand with each other or with their family expenses and their resources. So they can't really plan for the future in that situation.
No, in fact, they're starting to talk about divorce because of the mistrust now in the relationship. So. I know from talking with you prior that you're definitely a supporter of full disclosure.
Right.
And so what does that look like in a second marriage?
Well, in a second marriage, the hybrid, the three-pot approach is the one that most financial planners would agree upon.
Okay.
Because perhaps this person has had autonomy for a period of time, and they might go ahead and continue to have separate accounts, but yet have a joint account, so that they predetermine before marriage how they're going to split up on ratio basis who pays for what. So if his income is here and her income is here, well, then we develop a ratio of how much money, a percentage of their income.
So maybe I put 60% in the middle pot.
The middle pot. Yes.
And you put 40.
That's right.
And that's how we meet our bills.
They make decisions together about how this joint money is managed. And it's maybe it's a baby step toward managing their assets together, but it also recognizes that, people are adults and they can make their own decisions, and they may need that autonomy to take care of other things. Because remember, these families who come in together, they may have young adults.
Yes.
And so with young adults, you may find that, maybe it's always the mom, right? So it's the mom wanting to provide some supplemental help for a young adult child. And so this allows her to, without getting into discussion about the middle pot, have some autonomy to say, I have an obligation to help this child over here that's not your responsibility. And so I'm not going to take it from this joint account. And it's those boundaries that people need to develop. And that happens through the process of financial planning. It really doesn't have a lot to do with, divorce. It's just practical, setting up these systems and then working within them. And more importantly, and this is where a therapist can really help, is helping people to come together and open up these lines of communication, have healthy discussions about their money, and then a financial planner who will help implement these systems and encourage them to see an attorney to establish perhaps a prenuptial, or to do something creative with their estate planning and implement insurance or other ownership types to help them do what they need to do to be happy in this new union.
Yeah, another scenario that I see often is in approaching second marriages that you both probably typically have children with
Right.
other people at this
Right.
age. So you come to the marriage with
A lot
your
of
children,
baggage.
lots of baggage.
Lots of baggage.
But let's say I'm a successful businessman. I have children of my own. I find someone who I want to enter a second marriage with.
Yeah.
But they have a deadbeat dad.
Yeah.
And there's no way that these kids are going to be able to go to college based on just the mother's income and dad's over here in jail or
Right.
something.
Right.
You know, and I've heard a lot of men feel very fearful about entering this relationship because already the dynamic of being able to support my biological children, sending them to college. So do I take on the burden of her children and sending them to college?
You know, it's a mixed message bag out there
It
because
is.
when we were talking about FAFSA, and so the federal government wants that stepfather to include his assets in the calculation for what the child is eligible to receive in federal aid for school. So there's almost a presumption that that stepfather would be responsible for
Wow.
helping that child, but there's no legal obligation that he has to help, but there may be a family feeling of obligation.
Right.
That I'm taking this family and now there's a young person who needs help. Is it my role? And that needs to happen before somebody gets married and
Absolutely.
says we're going to meet with a financial planner and have this discussion about who is going to pay for what with college and how do we help that student get what they need and not yet ruin the goals that this person may have had for the assets he brought to the marriage.
Right, and I brought that up because I think it's so important in those scenarios to have someone like yourself and someone like myself or someone from my office involved.
Right.
Because these are serious issues.
And I think it takes both. I think that it
Absolutely.
takes, because I can deal with the family issue when it comes to family finances, but they need to be learning good communication skills with a skilled therapist who will say, okay, let's talk through who will be responsible for what. I can't do that with them. But when they come to me, then I can give them all these strategies and ways that they can accomplish this, so long as everybody comes to the table and is open and talking about it.
Right. Because I know in the scenario that I described, the male was struggling with so much guilt
Right.
that he had the resources and finances to send his own children to college.
That's right.
But didn't know that he could swing sending all
Of
four,
them. Yeah.
who were all similar ages.
Yeah.
He didn't know that he would be able to swing that. And how do you do that for your children and not for her children?
Right. Well, and that's where having a plan, because
Absolutely.
having a plan, you can sit down and say, okay, where is it likely this child will attend school? How much will it cost? What are our resources? Let me, financial advisor, run a FAFSA for you that will show you what, as a family, you will need to contribute for education. And then often, I get kind of involved in that situation beyond just planning and working with a student to say, let's go find some scholarship money, because it's important for kids to have ownership in that and to find a path of their
Definitely.
own to get there. And looking at colleges that might offer them more money than another one based on their family dynamic. And it's not necessarily wrong for this client to, say, these are not my natural born children. I haven't even legally adopted them. They're
Right.
my wife and dad's child, and legally that's where the responsibility it is. But they do get a mixed message with the FAFSA form when suddenly they're asked to provide information about their income and their assets. And it does affect the child.
Yeah. And I think that's a good illustration that shows, we need to deal with the guilt and the feelings involved
That's
in why you
right.
need a therapist, but then also that therapist to work in collaboration with you, of sending the
Right.
family to you, because you're just like this bank of information of financial resources and opportunity. And
I'll help you move forward, but
Right.
you've got to be able to come to the table with good communication skills for me to be able to do that. And then also on you and I are working together on this one. We're going to get that kid to college. aren't we?
right, which is
Yeah.
ultimately the most important thing.
which is the goal. But everybody having realistic expectations too, and being able to frame that with a family. And and often it might be the mom who's saying, I've married into this family that now has resources for my children, and being able to, as a financial advisor, set a different expectation to say, here's how this works, and let's talk with him about what he wants, respect him and what he wants to do in this situation.
Right. So let's take a minute and go back to John and Nancy.
John and Nancy,
the couple
on the
that
beach.
we started
Yes.
with. If you were to go back with them and apply some of the principles that you've talked about today, what would you do with them to help them in their situation?
Well, what I could see coming their way is some of the arguments that you and I are talking about money, and having 4 children who would attend college in the next 6 years. And so sitting down with them and doing a financial plan that would map out the children and the resources, and checking in with the exes on the outside to find out how they are going to contribute to helping to pay for college, and nailing some of these things down, because a wish is just a dream, but a plan can come true. And helping them to define these things, setting up some parameters, talking with them months before the wedding about the legal documents that they needed to have in place to protect one another. And then after divorce, looking at things like beneficiary changes and making sure that, somebody still doesn't have their ex on their pension plan as a beneficiary, or life insurance and things like that.
So there's so many things to consider.
Yep, there really are.
And just on a psychological standpoint, I would like to encourage people to not rush into second marriages. That you may love this person and you may want to marry them, and that's wonderful that you have found love again, but we really need to think about, how do I need to approach this in the smartest, most ethical, fair way, so we set ourselves up for success, versus setting ourselves up for failure, because we know from the research that almost 75% of second marriages end up in divorce. And I think it's probably because many of the things that we've discussed about today, there's not been enough planning of how various things are going to be handled. Well, Rhonda, we're so happy that you joined us today. This was such an important topic. And if you're out there and you're considering a second marriage, I suggest that you employ the skills of someone like Rhonda. She's located in Rochester, downtown Rochester, and easily accessible. And so I would encourage that you take advantage of her and a therapist and work together in this process. I also would like to remind you that if you have questions or ideas for shows that you would like to submit, that you can do so on our website at www.insightcounselingpc.com, or visit our Facebook page, Insight Counseling Services. Until next time, live well.